What should couples be thinking about when they want to put an embryo clause in their prenup?
Each person needs their own legal counsel, and it's a great place to put it in your prenup because people fighting over embryos in the context of their divorce. It is the woman's last chance to have biological children.
Why is a prenup the best and right place to initiate a conversation about who is paying for what?
It's the right place to have those conversations because it can steer the course of your marriage and the course of your relationship. You avoid a ton of arguments and disappointments later to manage expectations.
Do you think that having a prenup in place will increase or decrease the likelihood of divorce?
Prenups are not only what will happen to our stuff, it also addresses how are we going to treat money, and that remains true even if you never get divorced. Prenups are also tools for estate planning. Who will get what upon the untimely death of either partner? I don't believe that prenups directly lead to.
Welcome, Janene Oleaga. Thank you so much for being here, flying in from Maine. I'm excited to see you again, and I should let our audience know that we first met at ASRM in New Orleans. You have such a great service as a family formation attorney and reproductive rights advocate. You have an extensive background in criminal defense and matrimonial law. Let's start with what first drew you to practice law?
Oh, a deep knowledge that I was right about a lot of things, but I always knew that I wanted to go to law school or work in the legal field. And part of that was because I saw so much injustice in the world, and I've always been interested in representing people on the fringes of society, the disenfranchised. It's what drew me to criminal defense, and it's what drew me to fertility law now.
At the intersection of family law and fertility is assisted reproductive technology law. What was the catalyst for you to pursue this field?
So many of my friends, family members, everyone close to me, I watched as they navigated infertility through all different paths to becoming parents, right? I am very close with a gay couple, and I watched what they went through in order to have a child, and still so much loss, so many moving pieces, so much emotional and physical stress and planning. And my heart just went out to them. So that's what initially drew me into this field. And the more I learned, the more I wanted to know. So I'm still learning. I love this area of law. It's ever evolving. It's always interesting. So I don't see my interest waning anytime soon.
Can you explain to me the difference between assisted reproductive law and adoption law in your practice?
Yeah, so adoption law has been around for a long time. Every state has a framework for adoption. We all have a mechanism, and even beyond the United States, right? We have an understanding of what adoption is. Assisted reproduction law is totally different, right? We're not talking about establishing parental rights to a child that was not initially yours. We're talking about securing parental rights. The framework is very different in every state for assisted reproduction. Some states have statutes, some states have nothing, and some states have bans. So it makes practicing assisted reproduction law very complicated in the most interesting of ways.
Going back a few generations, why do you think the word prenup got such a bad rap?
We used to think of the trope of a much older, wealthier man marrying a much younger woman, right? And that was when people would start throwing around the word prenup. That's not always the case. And now millennials, Gen Z, they're interested in getting prenups. They want to talk about equity. They want to talk about money. So I think it's totally changing. Prenups are being rebranded, and it is a tool now for ensuring that there's equity in your marriage. And I always encourage people that are going through IVF, especially before they're married, to at least consider signing a prenup, and if not, an embryo disposition agreement.
And why are women now coming out and being the first to get a prenup more than ever before?
Women are tired of women's work being unpaid, or things that are classified as women's work being unpaid. I think when people speak out against surrogacy, it's the same thing, right? We're uncomfortable about women getting paid for things that they're used to doing for free. So when you're talking about prenups, and women are the ones pushing for prenups, it's typically because they're saying, I do want to be the primary caretaker of our children. I do want to take time out of the workforce. And that doesn't mean I shouldn't be compensated monetarily for it. I shouldn't be disadvantaged just because I'm choosing to focus on our household. And I think women are really tired of that work going unnoticed and unappreciated in the form of compensation.
Let's talk about cost. Art, as you know, is a very expensive process, and it's not widely available and at every income level. Why is a prenup the best and right place to initiate a conversation about who is paying for what?
I know it's not hot to talk about who is paying for what. It's just not fun, right? You're talking about getting married, having a family together, and now you're talking about who's paying for IVF. How much money are you going to give me if I stay at home with children? But it's the right place to have those conversations because it can steer the course of your marriage and the course of your relationship. And it's not that you cannot bridge the difference if you are at odds with certain opinions or feelings. It's that you need to talk about them at that point so that you're going to avoid a ton of arguments later and disappointments later, and you're going to manage expectations. A lot of prenups are about managing expectations between the parties.
What should couples be thinking about when they want to put an embryo clause in their prenup?
Ooh, well, look at the New York statute. I say look at the New York statute. We have a really good statute that addresses what an embryo disposition agreement requires. Each person needs their own legal counsel. It needs to be in writing. And it's a great place to put it in your prenup because that's when you're addressing who gets what in the context of your divorce. If you want to read a scary bedtime story, there is a ton of litigation in New York about that, especially people fighting over embryos in the context of their divorce. And typically, when you're talking about a heterosexual married couple, it is the woman's last chance to have biological children tied up in those embryos that she may or may not get. So talk about it early. And I know it's uncomfortable, but all of infertility is. So there's no better time than when you're first getting married.
Exactly. So let's dig a little deeper. What are the pros and cons about talking about art early in a prenup?
The pros and cons are that you can, let's start with pros. You can tease out the idea of what if we did face infertility and we needed to conceive with the assistance of an egg donor? And I would want that to be my sister. And your husband says, I would not want that to be your sister. And it's important to have those conversations early on. They may be irrelevant, just like most of your prenup. You might never need to address what you talked about, but you understand each other's position and feeling. And like I said, the cons are pretty much, it's not fun and it's not attractive or enjoyable, but it's necessary.
Mm-hmm. And there's no better time than to start the process, even if it pauses the romance.
Totally. I mean, it naturally probably will because it's not fun, but you have to do it. We were just talking earlier about how nobody wants to sit in a reproductive endocrinologist's office, right? Nobody wants to go to the IVF physician. It's just not a place you want to be. You hoped that you would conceive in a different way that didn't involve a doctor, right? And people want to meet with their fertility lawyer even less. So I often have people sitting in my office or meeting me over Zoom that never expected to be there, never wanted to be there, and certainly don't want to talk about infertility with a lawyer.
Do you think that having a prenup in place will increase or decrease the likelihood of divorce?
I don't think it increases the likelihood of divorce at all. Prenups are not only what will happen to our stuff should we get divorced, it also addresses how are we going to treat money in the context of our marriage. And that remains true even if you never get divorced. Prenups are also tools for estate planning, right? Who will get what upon the untimely death of either partner. So I don't believe that prenups directly lead to increased divorce rates.
And it's interesting because people spend hundreds of hours planning for a wedding and not talking at all about money. And money is funny. It's so funny. Some people find it hard to talk about money. Now, as a former family law attorney, talk us through the difference between ownership and dispositional control of an embryo.
This is what the New York statute addresses, and this is exactly what all of those court cases about people fighting over embryos get at, right? When you create embryos with somebody, whether you are married to them or not, you have joint ownership and dispositional control of the embryos. And what that means is, at least in New York, those embryos are your joint property. Joint dispositional control means that you must agree together to decide what to do with those embryos in order to access them. So for example, if one of you wants to move forward with embryo transfer and the other one doesn't, what happens now? And historically, we've seen that the party vetoing moving forward is going to win. Embryo disposition agreements make people have those conversations at the outset, much like a prenup, right? What will happen if we disagree? And you have to come to a conclusion. I will get them, right? A lot of women, just like prenups, are pushing for embryo disposition agreements because their worst nightmare is creating embryos that they won't ever be able to use to have children.
So how can same-sex couples who are in the position of using a donor sperm make a contract for this?
Typically, when people come to me for sperm donation contracts, it's between them as intended parents and their donor as sperm donor. In those contracts, they not only address who has ownership of the sperm once donated, who has dispositional control of the sperm once donated, but they also address who will be a legal parent and what will happen to any sperm or any embryos created with the donated sperm once the couple is finished building their family. It's a long process. It shouldn't be a long process, but it is a labor-intensive process in the sense that every donation arrangement is different, and each side should be represented by separate and independent legal counsel.
So do they contract this among themselves in a prenup or separately?
If you're working with a sperm donor, you're going to want a separate donation agreement just between you as parents and your donor. When you're talking about a prenup or an embryo disposition agreement, that's an agreement between the parties that they should each have separate legal counsel for. They can share legal counsel should they choose for a sperm donation agreement with their donor.
For those who are not familiar with the Alabama case, can you briefly tell us about it?
Yes, when I'm awake at night, this is what I'm thinking about. This case, the LePage case in Alabama, briefly what happened was that someone who was not authorized to be there went into where the embryos were stored at an IVF clinic. And they pulled a tube containing some embryos out of freezing cold temperatures, right? Negative 321 degree temperatures. Obviously, that's very cold. So they dropped the what was holding the embryos, and it fell, and the embryos were sadly destroyed. 3 families were impacted, and they together sued the clinic, and they sued for all of the things you would normally sue for, but also for wrongful death of a child. And they had argued that these embryos were children. No one understands more than infertility patients the value of embryos, but it's also true that infertility patients know that embryos don't equate to children. Mm-hmm. So the trial court said to these hopeful parents, I'm sorry, you cannot win on this claim of wrongful death of a child. And they appealed. Mm-hmm. And the Supreme Court of Alabama said, yes, embryos are children, even when they're not in a uterus. And then they wrote a lengthy opinion filled with religious language and other deeply concerning language from a legal perspective. The hard part was that while everyone wanted these people to recover what was lost, which is impossible, right? You can never get those embryos back. And certainly they deserve to be compensated. The IVF clinics in Alabama closed their doors overnight. How can you practice medicine if these embryos that are sitting at below freezing temperatures are now considered extrauterine children, which is what the court called them? So it was a terrible outcome. It was a truly sad case. And when I say how sad it is, I mean for those couples too, but it was sad for everyone in Alabama that was hoping to have children through IVF. Resolve and a number of advocates really moved quickly in passing legislation that enables IVF. It provides some indemnity to IVF physicians. They cannot be sued for destruction of embryos. Mm-hmm. It's still not great in the sense that there's still personhood on the books in Alabama. Personhood meaning giving embryos the same legal rights as children. So that case is a really tough case, and I am fearful that other states could potentially follow, especially in this climate right now.
So as you know, there's been some big news coming from President Trump that he intends to increase access to IVF and also lower the cost. That's the upside, but there's also obviously a downside. Talk us through the downside.
I am so hopeful. I know this was a topic of conversation at ASRM, yes, for sure. And I think we've been asking for increased access to IVF. When I say we, I mean ASRM, all of our members, right? Resolve forever, right? We want increased access. So I will remain hopeful that what the president said will be true, that we can increase access to IVF. The concern here is that under what circumstances and who will qualify, right? I don't love the rhetoric surrounding, of course, married heterosexual couples will be able to access IVF, right? Mm-hmm. I don't love the idea of a federal database for people to buy infertility medication through. What easier way to round up the people we know that are struggling with infertility, right? Mm-hmm. So I remain skeptical about implementation. I'm hoping more than anything to be wrong. I'm hoping that there is increased access to IVF, and I'm hoping that so many more people that could not previously afford to access this care now can. But I have some reservations about what those limits will be, mm-hmm, and what that regulation will look like.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell us what the government can do to improve things and get more access for fertility care?
Absolutely. Fertility insurance mandates, first and foremost. In Maine, we passed a fertility insurance mandate. New York has one. In the states that have fertility insurance mandates, we do see more access to care. That's only one factor, right? The out-of-pocket cost for infertility being lowered is a crucial factor, but it's not the only factor, right? We still have people who live in rural areas that cannot access care. And we need to see more people involved in legislative advocacy, pushing forward legislation and bills that will support access to care in this way. And the out-of-pocket cost is a major factor, but it's not the only factor.
With the current administration, I see there's a focus on increasing birth rates. Do you feel that fertility treatments like IVF is a way that they can increase the birth rate in America?
Sure, but I think we also need to fix what's going on in America as a whole right now. Mm-hmm. Yes, I do think access to IVF for more people will equate to more children. I'm hopeful. But there are people who are choosing to remain child-free, not due to infertility, but because of what's going on in this country as a whole. So I think it's one factor, but it's not the only factor that would lead to increased birth rates.
Surrogacy has been making headlines in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, with not such great news lately. What's your take on this?
This is a tough one, and I've been talking about this a lot lately. So I, along with all of my fertility law colleagues, know that there have been bad actors in this space, right? And I'm glad that they're being exposed. I want that, right? It's tough to see the bad actors stealing headlines, right? It's the sexy story when you're reporting on scandal. It's not as fun to report on all these happy families that were built through surrogacy. So I'm glad that they're being exposed, but I want the general public to know that for every one of those bad stories, there are so many more incredible stories of families being built through surrogacy. And yes, the bad actors need to be exposed. people do need to be made aware of the pitfalls and where they're vulnerable when they're pursuing surrogacy as a means of family building. But when it's used to broad stroke define surrogacy as exploitive or in some way commodification of women, that's where it becomes dangerous, right? Surrogacy as a whole is not bad because there are bad actors.
Switching gears, how has AI impacted your business?
It hasn't yet. AI was another big topic of conversation at ASRM this year, correct?
Right.
And most conferences lately, as it should be. But we are in a field where humanity is key. Yeah. What we do, there is a human touch point in all of it. So the one thing AI cannot be is human. So I am way less concerned than maybe some of my colleagues about how AI is going to impact a field that is so touched by what it is to be a human. So it has not impacted me in any way yet, but we'll see.
Should anyone in the fertility industry be concerned about job replacements? What are your thoughts?
I think there's a use for AI in the lab, things that can be automated that don't rely on a human judgment call or some aspect of knowledge beyond something that can be quantified or boil down to just data. There may be a use for AI in that, but like I said, it's really tough to replace people when the very essence of being a person is what dictates your work.
Exactly. Any new projects in the pipeline?
Ooh, for me personally, always. I really need to, I always say I have too many tabs open in my brain. I really want to see what happened after Dobbs and the Supreme Court returning the topic of abortion to the states. I obviously was disheartened with so many of my colleagues, but what they said was, we want to take this to the states. So what I want to see is some more state movement, and there are a ton of nonprofits and there are a ton of advocates popping up that are really doing some incredible work. So in legislative space, I want to see this push for more states to really get out in front and talk about what it means to need care, what it means to need the full spectrum of reproductive care. And I think that we can do that. So hopefully when it comes to legislative advocacy, seeing that. And also in like private space, I really like what some surrogacy agencies are doing, especially the ones I work with lately. I really like what I'm seeing from them being leaders in this space, making sure surrogacy is seen as a positive way of building a family and that the bad actors don't get all the attention.
I like to ask my guests what they like to do for their mental health. What are you doing for self-care?
Well, I do a lot of yoga.
Nice.
I can't promise that when I'm doing the yoga, I'm not thinking about stuff like
who is it?
Yes, but this is like my joy. I visited a couple 2 nights ago that live near me. They've been my clients for a long time, and they just had a baby through egg donation and surrogacy.
Wonderful.
And watching them, the sheer joy of them being parents, right? Knowing intimately what they went through as both my friends and my clients. Watching them with this baby that they are in awe of, I love that I am still not jaded to that. I still can see it and appreciate it. And I drove home thinking about how what I do is such a privilege, how now that this baby's here, we can't stop by saying, okay, well, the baby's here, my work is done. The world needs to be better for these children that we're fighting to bring into the world, right? So that's what pushes all of this legislative advocacy and what pushes me to look around and say, we have to make this place better. They will probably listen to this and they should know that I am so grateful that I got to play a role in their story.
Now, if there was a message you would like to leave with our listener today, what would that be?
I always tell people when they're starting any journey, build your team. Surround yourself and choose people to be on your team that you are in alignment with. And I mean from an ethical standpoint, from a standpoint about expectations regarding timeline and what's most important to you. When you're building your team, whether it be a surrogacy agency, an IVF clinic, mental health counseling, your yoga teacher, the people you're going to open up to and be vulnerable about infertility, right? You need to pick those people with intention, and you need to make sure that you're aligned, because that can make all the difference in your journey. It's a journey. So having the right people on your team is invaluable.
Absolutely. What is your preferred social media?
You can find me at IVF_ESQ on Instagram and IVFESQ.com.
Perfect, Janene. I'll be sure to include all of this in the show notes. Bottom line, get an attorney, an expert like you. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Lisa.